23 people died in Culpeper County, Virginia, between April and September of 1859. All were found with broken necks or crushed windpipes. No witnesses, no sounds of struggle. The local sheriff's office recorded each death as accident or natural causes, despite the identical nature of the injuries. What the official records never mentioned was that every single victim had one thing in common. They had all lived within 3 miles of the Rutledge plantation. And what those records deliberately concealed was that 3 weeks before the first death, something had emerged from a cellar that had been sealed shut for 12 years. The Confederate Army's own documents, declassified in 1963, contain a single disturbing line about Culpeper County in 1859. Local situation resolved, witnesses silenced. Recommend no further investigation. Before we continue with the story of what truly happened at the Rutledge plantation, I need to ask you something. This account was buried for over a century, hidden in archives that were never meant to be opened. If stories like this interest you, if you want to hear more cases that were deliberately erased from history, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments. Now, let me tell you about a man named Silas and the 12 years that transformed him into something that still haunts Culpeper County to this day. The story begins not with horror, but with something far more ordinary. And perhaps that's what makes it so disturbing. Culpeper County in 1847 was a place of rolling hills and tobacco fields, where the Blue Ridge Mountains stood as silent witnesses to the daily routines of plantation life. The county seat, with its population of barely 800 souls, existed in that peculiar southern state of genteel poverty, where white-columned facades hid homes with leaking roofs and empty pantries. The Rutledge plantation sat 5 miles southwest of town, a modest operation by Virginia standards, with only 42 enslaved people working 300 acres of increasingly exhausted soil. Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge was a man of particular habits and particular cruelties. At 53, he had never married, living alone in the main house except for the house servants who moved through the rooms like ghosts. His neighbors in Culpeper described him as proper and dignified, a man who attended church every Sunday and paid his debts on time. What they didn't see was how his hands shook with rage at the smallest provocation, how his voice could drop to a whisper that was somehow more terrifying than any shout. Silas had been born on the plantation in 1823, and from birth he had been different. His skin held no pigment, appearing almost translucent in certain light. His hair was white as cotton, his eyes a pale gray that seemed to look through people rather than at them. The other enslaved people whispered that he was marked, though whether by God or something else, no one could say. His mother, Ruth, had died when he was 7, and after that Silas had grown up largely alone, avoided by those who found his appearance unsettling. But Silas had something that made him valuable to Rutledge, an almost supernatural ability to work with horses. The most violent stallion would calm under his pale hands. Mares that refused to be bred would accept his presence. By the time he was 24, Silas was the plantation's head groom, a position that granted him small privileges, a private corner in the stable quarters, and occasional trips to town to purchase veterinary supplies. It was on one of these trips, in March of 1847, that Silas made his mistake. He had been sent to collect medicine for a horse with colic. The errand took him to the apothecary shop on Main Street, where he encountered a free black woman named Hannah, who worked as a seamstress in the building next door. She was perhaps 30, with intelligent eyes and quick hands that were never still. They spoke for no more than 3 minutes while Silas waited for the apothecary to prepare the medicine. Hannah mentioned that her brother worked on a farm in Pennsylvania. She told Silas that the North was different, that men like him could work for wages, could own property. 3 minutes. That's all it took to plant a seed that would grow into catastrophe. Silas began to plan. He was careful, patient, methodical. He saved scraps of food. He observed the patrol patterns of the night watch. He noted which roads led north and which were most heavily traveled. For 2 months he prepared, telling no one, keeping his face empty of expression whenever Rutledge or the overseer, a thick-necked man named Virgil Pruitt, came near. On the night of May 17, 1847, Silas made his attempt. The moon was dark, the spring air heavy with the smell of magnolia and coming rain. He slipped from the stable quarters at 2 in the morning, moving through shadows he had memorized. He made it almost 3 miles, following deer trails through the forest that bordered the plantation, his pale skin hidden beneath stolen dark clothes, a small bundle of provisions strapped to his back. The dogs found him at dawn. Pruitt and 3 other men rode him down like they were hunting a fox. They dragged him back to the plantation behind a horse, his body battered by rocks and roots, his stolen clothes torn to rags. When they threw him at Rutledge's feet, Silas didn't beg. He didn't speak at all. He simply looked up at the colonel with those pale grey eyes, and in that moment something passed between them, a recognition of mutual hatred so pure it needed no words. What happened next was witnessed by 7 people: Pruitt, the 3 riders, and 3 house servants who were working in the main house. Rutledge didn't have Silas whipped. He didn't sell him south, which was the usual punishment for runners. Instead, the colonel stood silent for a long moment, his face becoming very still in the way that those who knew him had learned to fear. "Take him to the root cellar," Rutledge said quietly. "Lock the door. No one enters without my permission." The root cellar was located beneath the kitchen house, a separate building that stood 30 feet from the main residence. It was a common feature of plantations, a place to store vegetables and preserved goods in the cool darkness below ground. The entrance was a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the earth, secured by an iron bolt and padlock. Stone steps led down into a chamber approximately 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet high at the center, with a curved ceiling that followed the arch of the supporting stones. They threw Silas down those steps at 9 o'clock on the morning of May 18, 1847. The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut was a rectangle of blue sky, and the last sound was the scrape of the bolt sliding home. The cellar had no windows. In summer, the temperature stayed cool around 60 degrees. In winter, it hovered just above freezing. The air was damp, thick with the smell of earth and stone. A small ventilation grate, no bigger than a man's fist, provided just enough air to breathe but not enough to dispel the constant moisture that beaded on the walls. For the first week, Silas screamed. He beat his fists against the door until they bled. He called out for mercy, for water, for light. The only response was the daily scrape of the bolt, the door opening just wide enough for a tin plate to be shoved through, containing whatever scraps the kitchen had left over: cornbread soaked in pot liquor, chicken bones with a few bits of meat, sometimes just a handful of raw turnips. A wooden bucket served as his toilet, emptied once every 3 days by whoever drew the short straw among the house servants. By the second week, Silas had stopped screaming. He had begun to understand that no one was coming to release him. This wasn't temporary punishment. This was something else entirely. The darkness was absolute. In that complete absence of light, time became meaningless. Silas couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. He would wave his hand in front of his face and see nothing, sense nothing except the movement of air. His albinism, which had always made bright sunlight painful, meant nothing here. In this place, he was no different than anyone else, equally blind, equally trapped. But Silas had something that saved him from immediate madness: routine. He had spent his entire life in rigid routine, the routine of enslaved labor, where every day followed the same pattern from before dawn until after dark. Now, in the cellar, he created a new routine. He began to move. At first, it was simply to keep warm, to fight off the damp cold that seeped into his bones. He paced the perimeter of the cellar, 12 feet, 8 feet, 12 feet, 8 feet, counting his steps, one hand trailing along the stone wall. 47 steps made a complete circuit. He walked circuits until his legs ached, then he stopped and did what he had seen the young men do in the quarters when they wanted to build strength. He lowered himself to the ground and pushed his body up with his arms, over and over, until his muscles trembled. Then, squats, deep knee bends that made his thighs burn. Then he would stretch, bending and twisting in the darkness, feeling his way through movements that kept his body from seizing up entirely. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months. The seasons changed above him, but in the cellar everything remained the same: cold, dark, damp. The only variation came in the food: fresh vegetables in summer and fall, dried corn and withered potatoes in winter. Silas marked time by these changes, his only calendar in the endless dark. He stopped speaking entirely after the 3rd month. There was no one to speak to, and he found that even talking to himself felt wrong, as though words were an intrusion in the silence. Instead, he lived inside his own head, replaying memories with perfect clarity. He remembered every horse he had ever trained. He remembered his mother's face, though she had been dead 17 years. He remembered Hannah's voice telling him about Pennsylvania, a place he would never see. And he remembered Rutledge's face in those final moments before the cellar door closed. The isolation did something to Silas's mind, not breaking it, but reshaping it, the way a tree grows around an obstacle. He developed a kind of meditation, a way of existing that required no external stimulation. He could sit motionless for hours, his breathing so slow and shallow that in the darkness he might have been mistaken for dead. During these periods he wasn't sleeping, he was simply being, existing in a state without thought or emotion, a blank void that matched the void around him. But other times, when the food came, when the bucket was emptied, Silas's mind became very sharp, very focused. He listened. The cellar door was thick wood, but sound traveled. He learned to identify people by their footsteps. Rutledge walked with a heavy, deliberate tread. Pruitt's boots scraped slightly, favoring his left leg. There was a house servant named Benjamin who moved quickly, nervously, his steps light and rapid. There was a cook, an older woman, whose knees cracked when she climbed down the kitchen house steps. Silas memorized these sounds. He catalogued them. He built a mental map of the world above him based purely on footsteps and voices that filtered down through the floorboards. He learned the rhythms of the plantation, the early morning when people moved quickly, preparing for the day's work, the midday quiet, the evening bustle, the deep night silence broken only by the occasional patrol. He exercised with increasing precision. His body had initially lost weight, growing lean and hollow. But as the months stretched into years, as he adapted to the meager rations and developed his routine, his body found a new equilibrium. He would never be large, the food was too sparse for that, but what muscle he had became dense and efficient. His movements in the dark became absolutely silent. He learned to place his feet with such care that even he couldn't hear his own footsteps. This wasn't a supernatural skill. It was the result of thousands of hours of practice in total darkness, where any stumble meant crashing into stone walls, where silence became its own form of meditation. His hands developed extraordinary sensitivity. In the darkness, touch became everything. He could identify objects by texture, by weight, by temperature. He knew every irregularity in the stone walls, every crack in the floor. When a rat occasionally found its way into the cellar, Silas could track it by the tiny sounds of its claws on stone, by the whisper of its fur against the floor. The rats became important. At first they had terrified him, their sudden touch in the darkness making him recoil in horror. But eventually, Silas came to see them differently. They were living things, like him. They could move freely between the cellar and the world above, something he could not do. And sometimes, when he was fast enough, he could catch them. He didn't eat them. The thought revolted him, even as hungry as he sometimes was. But he studied them, the way their bodies moved, how they navigated the darkness with such confidence. He held them gently in his hands, feeling the rapid flutter of their hearts, the delicate structure of their bones, before letting them go. From the rats, he learned things about anatomy, about where bodies were strong and where they were fragile. He learned where the neck joined the skull, where just a small amount of pressure could stop breath or break bone. This wasn't conscious study, not at first. It was simply something to occupy his mind, to fill the endless hours of darkness. But over time, over years, this knowledge settled into his bones, became instinctive. By the 5th year, Silas had stopped being entirely human in the conventional sense. Not because he had become something supernatural, but because he had adapted to an environment no human was meant to endure. He had become a creature of darkness and silence, his senses recalibrated, his mind restructured around survival in a void. He never forgot why he was there. He never forgot Rutledge's face, and in the darkness, with nothing but time and silence, Silas waited. He didn't rage. He didn't despair. He simply waited with the infinite patience of stone for the door to open one final time. Above him, the plantation continued its cycles. Seasons changed. Crops were planted and harvested. Enslaved people were born, grew old, died. The war that everyone said was coming drew closer with each passing year. Tensions between North and South escalated. Politicians in Washington made speeches. Newspapers printed increasingly angry editorials. And in Culpeper County, people slowly forgot that there had ever been a pale-skinned slave named Silas who had tried to run north. Only Rutledge remembered, and he never spoke of what was locked in the cellar beneath his kitchen house. The years between 1847 and 1859 transformed Virginia. The political tensions that had simmered for decades reached a boiling point. In Culpeper County, the changes were subtle but persistent. Young men began to talk more openly about states' rights and northern aggression. Militia groups formed, drilling on Sunday afternoons. The price of cotton fluctuated wildly. Plantation owners worried about their investments, about the possibility of losing everything if the abolitionists in Washington had their way. Rutledge grew older, more isolated. He had always been a solitary man, but as he moved through his 60s, his isolation became absolute. He stopped attending church. He took his meals alone. The only person he spoke to regularly was Pruitt, his overseer, and those conversations were limited to plantation business. The house servants learned to move through the main house like shadows, anticipating his needs without being asked, avoiding his cold gaze. But every 3 days, someone had to go down to that cellar. The duty rotated among the house servants, and it was universally dreaded. Not because Silas was violent, he never was, but because of the silence. The person would open the door, push through the food, and sometimes in the darkness they would sense movement. They would hear breathing slow and measured. But Silas never spoke. He never came to the door. He never begged or pleaded. He simply waited in the darkness, and that silence was more terrifying than any amount of screaming would have been. Benjamin, the house servant with the quick, nervous steps, once told another slave that looking into that cellar was like looking into a grave where something was still alive. The comment spread through the slave quarters, whispered in the darkness of their own cabins. Parents used the cellar as a threat to frighten misbehaving children. Be good, or master will put you down there with the ghost man. But the cellar and its occupant remained largely forgotten by the white population of Culpeper County. Rutledge never mentioned it. Pruitt, who had been present at Silas's imprisonment, knew better than to speak of it. The few other white men who had been there that day had either died or moved away. By 1859, there were perhaps a dozen people who remembered that anyone was locked beneath the kitchen house, and most of them were enslaved people who had no voice to tell the story. Then came April of 1859, and everything changed. John Brown had been hanged the previous December after his raid on Harper's Ferry, and Virginia was gripped by paranoia about slave revolts. Militias patrolled the roads at night. Any gathering of enslaved people was viewed with suspicion. Plantation owners slept with pistols under their pillows. On the morning of April 3, 1859, Colonel Thaddeus Rutledge suffered a stroke. He had been sitting at breakfast when his right hand suddenly lost all strength, the coffee cup he was holding crashing to the floor. His face sagged on one side. When he tried to speak, only garbled sounds emerged. They carried him upstairs to his bedroom. A doctor was summoned from town, a young man named Isaac Brennan, who had only recently set up practice in Culpeper. Brennan examined Rutledge and gave his prognosis. The colonel would likely survive, but he was paralyzed on his right side and unable to speak clearly. He would require constant care. Rutledge lingered for 3 weeks. During that time, he could only communicate through grunts and gestures. His left hand, still functional, would sometimes make frantic movements, pointing, grasping at the air. The servants attending him couldn't understand what he wanted. They brought him water, adjusted his pillows, read to him from the Bible. But whatever Rutledge was trying to communicate remained locked inside his damaged mind. He died on April 23rd, at 3 in the morning. Benjamin was sitting with him when it happened. Later, Benjamin would tell the others that in his final moments, Rutledge's eyes had been wide open, staring at the ceiling, and his left hand had been making a turning motion over and over, as if unlocking a door. The funeral was held 2 days later. Rutledge had no close family, only distant cousins who lived in Richmond and had no interest in a struggling tobacco plantation. The estate would have to be settled, sold most likely. Pruitt remained as temporary overseer, but everyone knew the plantation was finished. The enslaved people waited anxiously to learn their fates, knowing they would likely be sold to pay Rutledge's debts. It was during this period of uncertainty that the cellar was forgotten entirely. With Rutledge dead and the plantation in disarray, the rigid routines that had governed life for decades began to break down. No one remembered to take food to the cellar beneath the kitchen house. The door remained locked, but the daily feeding simply stopped. For 3 days, Silas received no food. No. This wasn't entirely unusual. There had been times over the years when the feeding schedule was irregular, but this was different. On the 4th day, Silas began to understand that something had changed. The sounds above him were wrong. There was too much activity, too many footsteps, too many voices. And then, for a full day and night, there was almost nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just an eerie quiet. What Silas couldn't know was that most of the enslaved people had been taken to town, lined up to be assessed by a slave trader who would purchase them and transport them south. Only a skeleton crew remained at the plantation. Pruitt, 2 field hands, and an elderly cook who was too old to fetch much at auction. On the evening of April 28th, 5 days after Rutledge's death, one of the field hands, a young man named Thomas, was tasked with checking the kitchen house to see what supplies remained. He wasn't one of the house servants. He had only been working at the Rutledge plantation for 8 months, purchased from a farm in Louisa County. He had never been told about the cellar or what it contained. Thomas entered the kitchen house as the sun was setting. The building had an abandoned feel, the fire in the hearth cold, the work tables bare. He was looking for anything valuable, anything that might be sold or kept. His lamp cast moving shadows across the walls as he searched through cabinets and storage bins. He almost didn't notice the door set into the floor near the back wall, hidden partially behind a shelf unit. The padlock was old, rusted. On impulse, Thomas tried it, and found to his surprise that the lock was loose, the mechanism worn through after 12 years of moisture and neglect. With a sharp tug, the lock opened. Thomas lifted the angled door. A smell rose from below. Not quite rot, but something organic and old, the smell of a place that had been sealed away from air and light for too long. He held his lamp over the opening and called down. "Anyone there?" Silence answered him. Thomas hesitated. He should report this to Pruitt, but curiosity, and perhaps some buried rebellious instinct, made him descend the stone steps into the darkness. His lamp illuminated the space gradually. At first, he saw nothing but empty stone and shadows. Then he saw the bucket, the tin plate, and finally, in the far corner, a figure sitting with its back against the wall. Thomas raised the lamp higher, and what he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The figure was a man, impossibly thin, his skin so pale it seemed to glow slightly in the lamplight. White hair hung to his shoulders. His eyes were closed, his breathing so shallow that Thomas initially thought he might be dead. But then those eyes opened, and Thomas saw that they were a pale grey, almost colourless, and they looked at him with perfect clarity, and no surprise at all. "My God," Thomas whispered. "How long have you been down here?" The figure didn't answer. It didn't move. It simply looked at Thomas with those terrible, patient eyes. Thomas backed toward the steps, suddenly terrified in a way he couldn't articulate. This wasn't a man. This was something that had been a man once, before the darkness had changed him into something else. Thomas ran. He left the lamp, left the door open, and ran through the growing darkness to find Pruitt. When he finally located the overseer in the main house, going through Rutledge's papers, the words came out in a jumbled rush. "There's someone in the cellar, under the kitchen. I don't know how long. He's alive, but he's—" Thomas struggled to find words. "He's wrong. Something's wrong with him." Pruitt's face went very still. He set down the papers he'd been reading and looked at Thomas for a long moment. "You opened the cellar?" "The lock was rusted through. I didn't know. Nobody told me." "Did he come out?" "No, he's just sitting there. I don't think he can—" Pruitt moved faster than Thomas expected, grabbing his shotgun from where it leaned against the wall. "Show me." But they returned to the kitchen house together, Pruitt's shotgun ready. The door to the cellar stood open, Thomas's abandoned lamp still burning on the steps, casting a weak light into the space below. Pruitt moved to the edge and looked down. The cellar appeared empty. The tin plate sat in the center of the floor. The bucket was in its corner. But the figure Thomas had seen was gone, as though it had never been there at all. "Where is he?" Pruitt demanded. "He was right there in the corner, I swear." A sound came from outside, barely audible. The soft creak of a floorboard on the kitchen house porch. Pruitt spun toward the door, raising his shotgun. "Come out," he called. "Come out now, or I'll shoot." Nothing moved. The evening had deepened into full night, and beyond the kitchen house door everything was dark. Pruitt took a step forward, then another. Thomas stayed behind him, his heart hammering. They searched for an hour with more lamps, calling out to the other two men on the property to help. But they found nothing. No pale figure. No tracks. Nothing to indicate that anyone had left the cellar at all, except that it was undeniably empty. "Maybe he died," Thomas suggested weakly. "Maybe I saw a corpse and it just seemed like he was alive." But there was no body. There was nothing. By midnight, Pruitt had convinced himself that Thomas had been mistaken, had seen shadows and imagined a figure in the darkness. They secured the cellar door with a new lock and tried to forget about it. The plantation was being sold anyway. In a few weeks, none of this would be their concern. What they didn't know was that Silas had left the cellar the moment Thomas had run up the steps. He had moved with absolute silence, up and out into the night, his eyes adjusting rapidly to the darkness that was still brighter than anything he'd experienced in 12 years. He had disappeared into the woods that bordered the plantation, moving between the trees like smoke, his pale skin and white hair making him nearly invisible in the moonlight filtering through the leaves. For the first time in 12 years, Silas was free. And he had a list in his mind, written in the darkness over thousands of hours, of everyone who had put him in that cellar or kept him there. Starting with Pruitt. The first death occurred on May 2nd, 1859, 4 days after the cellar had been opened. Virgil Pruitt was found in the barn at dawn by the elderly cook who had come to start her morning chores. She had been crossing the yard when she noticed the barn door standing open. Unusual because Pruitt was meticulous about securing the animals at night. She approached cautiously and peered inside. What she saw made her scream so loudly that it brought both Thomas and the other field hand, a man named Samuel, running from opposite ends of the property. Pruitt was sitting upright against one of the stall doors, his eyes wide open, his mouth slightly ajar. At first glance he appeared to simply be resting. But as Thomas drew closer, he saw the unnatural angle of Pruitt's head tilted too far to one side. When Thomas touched the body, trying to rouse him, Pruitt's head lolled loosely, and Thomas jerked his hand back with a gasp. The neck was broken, completely severed at the spine. There were no signs of struggle. The barn was undisturbed. Pruitt's shotgun leaned against the wall 5 feet away, both barrels still loaded. The horses in their stalls were calm. It appeared that someone had approached Pruitt in the darkness, gotten close enough to touch him, and snapped his neck with a single, precise movement before he could react or cry out. The county sheriff, a heavy-set man named Walter Cunningham, arrived by mid-morning. He examined the body, questioned the 3 remaining people on the property, and came to the only conclusion that seemed plausible. Pruitt had surprised a thief, possibly an escaped slave or vagrant who had killed him to avoid capture. The fact that nothing was stolen suggested the killer had been interrupted before completing the robbery. Cunningham organized a search party, 15 men on horseback with dogs, who combed the woods surrounding the plantation. They found nothing, no tracks, no campsites, no evidence that anyone had been hiding in the forest. After 2 days, the search was called off. Pruitt was buried in the Culpeper Cemetery, and the plantation was locked up, pending final sale. Thomas, Samuel, and the cook were sent to a holding house in town to await auction. The Rutledge property sat empty, the house slowly being reclaimed by dust and silence. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Life in Culpeper County continued its rhythms. Then, on May 17th, exactly 12 years to the day after Silas had been locked in the cellar, a farmer named John Keller was found dead in his field. Keller's farm was 2 miles from the Rutledge plantation. He had been a minor player in local affairs, notable mainly for his aggressive participation in slave patrols. He was 52 years old, a widower with 3 grown sons who worked the farm with him. On the morning of May 17th, his sons went to wake him and found his bedroom empty, the bed unmade, the back door standing open. They found him an hour later, lying face down in the tobacco field. Like Pruitt, his neck was broken. Unlike Pruitt, Keller had clearly tried to fight. His hands were bruised and cut, his shirt torn. But whatever had killed him had been fast and overwhelmingly strong. The sheriff estimated he had been dead since sometime after midnight. This death troubled Cunningham more than Pruitt's. Keller's farm was secure. The man had been a light sleeper, paranoid about property theft. For someone to enter his house, lure or force him outside, and kill him without waking his 3 sons sleeping in the adjacent room suggested a level of stealth and planning that didn't fit with the theory of a random vagrant. The sheriff began to look for patterns. 2 deaths, both by broken neck, both men who had some connection to plantation operations. He pulled out the records from Rutledge's estate and noticed something that made him pause. 12 years earlier, almost to the day, there had been an incident involving a runaway slave. The slave had been caught and locked in a cellar beneath Rutledge's kitchen house. Cunningham rode out to the now empty plantation. He found the kitchen house with its padlocked cellar door. He broke the lock and descended into the darkness with a lamp. The space was empty, but the air had that particular smell of long human habitation. On one wall, someone had scratched marks into the stone. Hundreds and hundreds of marks, organized in groups of 7. Days counted, years tallied. The sheriff climbed back up into the sunlight, feeling deeply uneasy. He checked Rutledge's records more carefully and found a notation from 1847. Silas Albino, 24 wars, attempted escape secured. There were no further entries about Silas. No sale, no death, nothing. Cunningham began asking questions. The enslaved people from the Rutledge plantation had been sold and scattered across 3 counties, but he managed to track down Benjamin, now owned by a merchant in town. Benjamin was reluctant to talk, but eventually, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confirmed what Cunningham suspected. Silas had been kept in that cellar for 12 years, fed just enough to survive, never let out. Never seen by anyone except the person who pushed food through the door every 3 days. And when Rutledge died, Cunningham asked. Nobody remembered, Benjamin said. With everything happening, the feeding just stopped. Then Thomas found the cellar open, said there was someone down there, but when Pruitt looked, it was empty. How long between when Thomas opened the door and when Pruitt checked? Maybe an hour. Thomas came running, took time to convince Pruitt. Then they went back together. An hour. More than enough time for someone to climb out and disappear. Cunningham did the math. Silas would be 36 years old now. An albino man with white hair and pale skin would be distinctive, memorable. But Cunningham hadn't heard any reports of anyone matching that description. Of course, if the man was moving at night, avoiding roads, staying in the forest. The sheriff put out word to all neighboring counties. Wanted for questioning. A male Negro, approximately 36 years of age, albino, white hair, pale skin, extremely dangerous. Approach with caution. Suspected in 2 murders. 3 days later, another body was found. Marcus Webb, a former slave trader who had retired to a small house on the outskirts of Culpeper. Webb had been killed in his sleep, suffocated with his own pillow held over his face with such force that it had broken his nose and cracked his front teeth. The pillow was still there, pressed against his face, held in place by Webb's own folded hands, positioned there by whoever had killed him. This detail disturbed Cunningham more than the violence itself. It suggested a kind of theatrical cruelty, a message being sent. We're coming for you while you sleep. You won't see us, you won't hear us, and you can't stop us. The killings continued through May and into June, always at night, always sudden. Sometimes a broken neck, sometimes suffocation. Once a man was found drowned in his own horse trough, held under until he stopped struggling. The victim seemed random at first, but as Cunningham dug deeper, he found connections. Each victim had either worked for the Rutledge plantation at some point, had served on slave patrols, or had been involved in the capture of runaways. Someone was working through a list. Someone was exacting very specific revenge, and that someone moved through Culpeper County like a ghost, invisible, silent, striking without warning, and disappearing without trace. The panic began slowly, then accelerated. Families that lived outside of town started moving in with relatives, seeking safety in numbers. Men slept with guns. Patrols were organized, but they found nothing. The killing simply continued, methodical and unstoppable. By July, 19 people were dead. The newspapers had picked up the story. Richmond sent a special investigator, a former Army officer named Captain Edward Hayes, who had experience tracking guerrillas during the conflicts in Bleeding, Kansas. Hayes set up headquarters in Culpeper and began a systematic investigation. He interviewed witnesses, studied the pattern of deaths, and came to a conclusion that he shared with Sheriff Cunningham in private. Whoever is doing this has military-level discipline. They're patient, they're planning each kill carefully, and they're operating with a specific objective. This isn't random violence, this is an execution list. You think it's this Silas? Cunningham asked. I think it's someone who has been planning this for a very long time, Hayes replied. And I think we're running out of time to stop them. Hayes was right. The deaths had a momentum now, a rhythm that suggested they were building toward something. The question was, what would happen when the killer reached the end of their list? Captain Hayes implemented a strategy that was as much psychological warfare as practical defense. He published notices in the Culpeper Observer and posted them throughout the county, asking anyone who had any connection to the Rutledge plantation between 1847 and 1859 to come forward and report to his office for protection. The response was telling. 47 people presented themselves, their faces pale with fear, each one convinced they might be next on the invisible killer's list. Hayes organized them into groups, housing them in the town's 3 largest buildings, the courthouse, the Methodist church, and the Masonic Hall. Armed guards were posted at every entrance. No one was allowed to leave after sunset. It was, in effect, a self-imposed imprisonment designed to keep potential victims safe while drawing the killer out. For 5 nights, nothing happened. The town held its breath. Then, on the morning of July 23rd, one of the guards at the Methodist church was found dead at his post. His neck was broken, his body positioned in his chair in such a way that from a distance he appeared to be sleeping. The killer had walked past him, entered the church, and left again without anyone inside hearing a sound. When Hayes and Cunningham entered the church, they found something that made their blood run cold. Written on the wall in chalk, in neat, careful letters, was a list of names. 19 names were crossed out, the victims already dead. 28 names remained, and at the top of the list, underlined 3 times, was a name that made Hayes curse under his breath. Benjamin Rutledge. "Who is that?" Cunningham asked. Hayes checked his notes. "Rutledge's cousin, lives in Richmond. He inherited the plantation after Rutledge died, then sold it immediately. He's the one who authorized the sale of all the enslaved people. So he's not here. He's in Richmond." "He was in Richmond," Hayes corrected grimly. "I'll need to send a telegram immediately." The response came back 3 hours later. Benjamin Rutledge had left Richmond 2 days earlier, traveling to Culpeper to meet with lawyers about some remaining property disputes. He was staying at the Chapman Hotel on Main Street, room 7, second floor. Hayes and Cunningham ran. They burst into the hotel, taking the stairs 2 at a time, the hotel owner shouting protests behind them. Hayes kicked open the door to room 7 and stopped. Benjamin Rutledge sat in a chair by the window, looking out at the street below. He was a thin man in his early 40s, wearing an expensive suit that hung loosely on his frame. He didn't turn when they entered. He didn't move at all. Hayes approached slowly. "Mr. Rutledge?" No response. Hayes reached out and touched the man's shoulder, and Rutledge's body tilted forward, then fell to the floor with a heavy thump. His neck was broken, his spine severed so completely that his head had been hanging on by skin alone. The window was open. A slight breeze moved the curtains. Hayes looked out and saw the alley below, empty except for shadows. On the windowsill, barely visible, were marks in the dust, handprints, pale against the dark wood. "He climbed up the outside of the building," Hayes said quietly. "Second floor brick wall, no handholds. He climbed it like it was nothing." This death changed everything. The killer wasn't just moving through the county unseen. He was capable of physical feats that seemed impossible. More than that, he had entered a guarded building in the middle of the day, climbed an exterior wall, killed a man in a room on the second floor, and left without anyone seeing him. The panic that had been building in Culpeper County broke into full hysteria. Families fled to Richmond, to Charlottesville, anywhere that seemed safer than staying. Businesses closed. The county essentially shut down. Of the 47 people who had reported to Hayes for protection, 32 left town entirely, willing to risk the journey rather than wait for death to find them. Hayes knew he was losing control of the situation. He needed to change tactics. Instead of waiting for the killer to strike, he needed to hunt. But how do you hunt someone who moves like smoke and strikes like lightning? The answer came from an unexpected source. Thomas, the young field hand who had opened the cellar, had been staying in town under Hayes's protection. One evening, as Hayes was reviewing his notes in the courthouse, Thomas approached him hesitantly. "Sir, I've been thinking about something." Hayes looked up. "What is it?" "When I saw him in the cellar, he was just sitting there, still as stone. I don't think he was surprised that I opened the door. I think he was waiting, like he knew it would open eventually." "What's your point?" "He's patient, sir. More patient than any person I've ever seen." "What if that's his strength? He can wait. He can stay still. He can hide in plain sight because he doesn't need to move." Hayes considered this. "You're saying he's here, in town, hiding somewhere, waiting for his next opportunity. I'm saying he might be somewhere we've already looked, somewhere we didn't see him because we didn't know how to look." That night, Hayes organized a different kind of search. Instead of moving quickly through buildings and alleys, his men moved slowly, methodically, checking every shadow, every crawl space, every corner that could conceal a motionless human form. They worked in teams of 4, with lanterns, searching the empty buildings that dotted the town. They found him in the abandoned grist mill on the edge of town, 3 hours after midnight. He was sitting in the rafters, 20 feet above the floor, his pale skin and white hair making him nearly invisible against the whitewashed beams. He wasn't hiding exactly. He was simply sitting, watching, waiting. When the lantern light found him, his eyes reflected like an animal's, pale and unblinking. "Silas," Hayes called up. "Come down. We need to talk." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Silas moved, and even expecting it, even watching for it, the men barely saw him move. He simply dropped from the rafter, landing in a crouch that should have shattered his legs from that height, then straightened and stood facing them. In the lantern light, he looked less like a man and more like something carved from white stone. He was impossibly thin, his skin stretched tight over muscle and bone. His hair hung past his shoulders, white as fresh snow. His eyes were colorless, reflecting the light without seeming to absorb it. He wore clothes that were filthy and torn, scavenged from somewhere. And he stood absolutely still, not even appearing to breathe. "Silas," Hayes repeated. "I'm Captain Edward Hayes. I'm investigating the deaths in this county." Silas didn't respond. His eyes moved from Hayes to the other three men, assessing, calculating. Hayes noticed that Silas stood with perfect balance, his weight distributed evenly, his hands loose at his sides. He looked relaxed, but Hayes had seen enough soldiers to recognize a fighting stance when he saw one. "I know what happened to you," Hayes continued. "I know about the cellar. 12 years. No man should endure what you endured." Still nothing. Silas's face was expressionless, blank as a sheet of paper. It was like talking to a statue. "But you've killed 20 people. 20 men. And while some of them may have deserved your anger, the law still applies. You understand that, don't you? You have to answer for what you've done." Silas tilted his head slightly, the first real movement he'd made. When he finally spoke, his voice was a hoarse whisper, rusty from disuse. "The law?" Those two words carried more contempt than any amount of shouting could have conveyed. "Yes," Hayes said. "The law. I know it failed you. I know the justice system in Virginia allowed your imprisonment. But two wrongs don't make a right. You can't just kill everyone who wronged you. Why not?" The question was simple, direct, and Hayes found he didn't have a good answer. In the silence that followed, one of the deputies, a young man named Peter who had been on edge since entering the mill, made a mistake. He moved his hand toward his pistol, just a slight movement, probably unconscious. But Silas saw it. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. Silas moved with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had been sitting still moments before. He closed the distance to Peter, 15 feet, before anyone could react. His hand flashed out, not striking, but pressing against Peter's throat in a very specific way. Peter's eyes went wide, his mouth opened in a silent gasp, and he collapsed. The other two deputies drew their pistols and fired. The shots were deafening in the enclosed space of the mill, the muzzle flashes blinding. But Silas was no longer where he had been. He had moved into the shadows, and in the confusion and darkness, he was gone. One moment he had been there. The next he had simply disappeared, as completely as if he had never existed. They found Peter alive, barely. Silas had pressed on his carotid artery and a specific point on his neck, causing him to lose consciousness without breaking anything. It was a measured response, not intended to kill. A warning. Hayes and his men searched the mill from top to bottom. They found a small space in the rafters where Silas had clearly been living. A collection of stolen food, several bottles of water, and a piece of paper with a list of names written in careful script. It was the same list that had been on the church wall, but this version had notes beside each name. Times, locations, routines. Silas had been watching his victims for weeks, learning their habits, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The hunt intensified. Hayes brought in more men from Richmond, organized shifts so that patrols covered the town 24 hours a day. They posted guards at every building where potential victims were sheltered. They set up checkpoints on all roads leading out of Culpeper. It became a siege, with the entire town as the fortress and one pale killer as the army trying to breach the walls. But Silas had learned patience in the cellar. He had learned to wait, to endure, to exist without action until the perfect moment presented itself, and he was willing to wait as long as it took. Days passed, then weeks. August arrived with oppressive heat. The town remained locked down. Some people began to believe that Silas had fled, that the increased security had driven him away. Hayes didn't believe it. He could feel the waiting, like a held breath, like a drawn bow waiting to release. On August 15th, Hayes received a report that made his stomach drop. One of the names on Silas's list, a man named Howard Fleming, who had been a slave patrol leader in the 1840s, had convinced himself that the danger had passed. Against Hayes's explicit orders, Fleming had left his guarded quarters in the courthouse and returned to his farm 6 miles outside of town, taking his 2 adult sons with him for protection. Hayes rode out immediately with 6 armed men. They arrived at Fleming's farm at dusk and found the front door standing open. Inside, they found Howard Fleming and his 2 sons. All 3 had been killed, their necks broken with professional efficiency. The deaths had occurred within the last hour, the bodies still warm. But what disturbed Hayes most was a detail he almost missed. On the kitchen table, arranged in a neat row, were 3 tin cups, each filled with water. Next to them was a plate with 3 pieces of cornbread. It was a mirror of what Silas had received in the cellar. Meager rations, barely enough to survive, served on tin. The symbolism was clear. This is what you gave me. Now I give it back. As Hayes stood in that kitchen, looking at the macabre display, he realized something that chilled him more than any of the violence he had witnessed. Silas wasn't just killing out of rage or revenge. He was making statements. He was creating a narrative. Each death was a chapter in a story he was telling, a story about injustice and punishment, about 12 years stolen and paid back in blood. He's not going to stop, Hayes said aloud. Even if we kill him, even if we capture him, the story will continue. People will remember this. One of the deputies spoke up. So what do we do? Hayes looked at the 3 bodies, at the cups of water, at the carefully arranged scene. We try to end the story before it destroys this entire county. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Benjamin, the former house servant who had tended to Rutledge during his final illness. Benjamin had been living in town under protection, and one evening he approached Hayes with information he had been too frightened to share before. There's one more place he might go, Benjamin said quietly. One place that matters more than all the others. Where? The cellar, where it all started. He'll go back there eventually, I know it. That place is part of him now. Hayes considered this. Why would he return? There's nothing there. That's exactly why. Benjamin insisted. Everything that happened to him, everything he became, it all started in that cellar. He needs to finish it there. It was a thin theory, based more on intuition than evidence, but Hayes was running out of options. The list of names was dwindling, and with each death, Silas seemed to grow bolder, more willing to take risks. If Benjamin was right, if Silas was building toward some final act at the place where his imprisonment had begun, then Hayes needed to be ready. He organized an ambush. 20 men, the best shots in the county, positioned around the abandoned Rutledge plantation. They arrived at midnight on August 28th, moving into position in complete silence. Hayes placed men in the main house, in the barn, in the trees surrounding the kitchen house. The cellar door was left as it had been found, unlocked, slightly ajar, an invitation. Then they waited. Hours passed. The night was hot and still, the air thick with humidity. Insects sang in the darkness. An owl called from the trees. The men stayed motionless, fighting exhaustion, their fingers resting lightly on their triggers. Dawn was perhaps an hour away when Hayes heard it. The softest sound, barely more than a whisper of disturbed air. He looked toward the kitchen house and saw nothing, but he knew with absolute certainty that someone was there. He raised his hand, signaling the men to hold their positions. For several minutes nothing moved, then so slowly that it seemed like a trick of the fading darkness. A pale figure emerged from the shadows near the kitchen house. Silas walked across the yard with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had all the time in the world. He reached the cellar door, paused with his hand on the frame, and then descended the steps into the darkness below. Hayes counted to 30, giving Silas time to fully enter the cellar. Then he gave the signal. 20 men converged on the kitchen house from all directions, their weapons raised, their movements as coordinated as any military operation. Hayes reached the cellar door first and called down into the darkness. "Silas, it's over. Come up with your hands visible." Silence answered him. Hayes lit a lantern and descended the steps, his pistol drawn, 2 deputies behind him. The cellar looked exactly as it had when Thomas had first opened it months before. Empty, except for the old bucket and tin plate. But Silas was there, sitting in the same corner where Thomas had seen him, his back against the stone wall, his pale eyes reflecting the lantern light. "It ends here," Hayes said. "One way or another, it ends here." Silas looked at him, and for the first time, Hayes saw something like emotion in those colorless eyes. Not anger, not fear, something more complicated. Exhaustion, perhaps, or satisfaction. "It ended 12 years ago," Silas said quietly. "This is just finishing what was started. You've killed 23 people. They took 12 years from me, 12 years of darkness. They made me into this." He gestured at himself, at his pale skin and white hair, at the too thin frame that somehow still moved with deadly precision. "And now they're surprised when this is what they get. The law." "There is no law," Silas interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge like broken glass. "There was no law when they locked me in here. There was no law when they fed me scraps like a dog. There was no law when they forgot about me entirely, left me to die in the darkness. You want to talk to me about law now? After everything?" Hayes found he had no response to that. The truth was, Silas was right. The law had failed him absolutely and completely. What recourse did a man have when the entire system was designed to deny his humanity? "So what now?" Hayes asked. "You kill everyone on your list and then what? You disappear? You keep killing until someone stops you?" "I go north," Silas said simply. "Pennsylvania. Find a woman named Hannah who told me about freedom. That was the plan 12 years ago. That's still the plan. You really think you can just walk away after 23 murders? I think no one will follow me very far. I think the people of Culpeper County will be happy to let this story end, let me disappear into legend. I think you'll tell them I died or escaped or vanished, and everyone will be relieved to put this behind them." Hayes realized with a sinking feeling that Silas was probably right. The county wanted this nightmare to end. If Silas disappeared, if there were no more deaths, most people would be content to let the mystery remain unsolved. "I can't let you go," Hayes said, but even he could hear the lack of conviction in his voice. "You can't stop me," Silas replied. "You brought 20 men, maybe more, and you think that's enough?" He stood up, the movement fluid and controlled. "I've had 12 years to think about this moment. 12 years to plan. Do you really think I walked into this cellar without knowing exactly how to walk back out?" Before Hayes could respond, before anyone could react, Silas moved. But not toward Hayes or the deputies. Instead, he moved toward the wall, toward a section of stone that looked identical to every other section. His hand pressed against it, and something shifted. A section of the wall, perhaps 3 feet square, pushed inward, revealing darkness beyond. "The plantation was part of the Underground Railroad," Silas said, pausing at the opening. "Rutledge didn't know. His father built this tunnel in 1820, connecting the cellar to a root cellar in the woods half a mile away. I found it after 3 years of searching these walls in the dark, 1 inch at a time." He looked back at Hayes. "I could have left any time after that, but I waited. I waited until Rutledge was dead, until everyone who put me here could understand what it meant to be hunted, to be afraid, to know that death was coming and not be able to stop it." He stepped into the opening, and his pale form began to fade into the darkness. "Tell them whatever you want. Tell them I died in the cellar. Tell them I escaped. It doesn't matter. The story is already written." Hayes raised his pistol, but his hand shook. He could shoot. He could call for his men to pursue Silas into that tunnel. But looking into Silas's eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there, Hayes knew it would be futile. This man had survived 12 years in darkness. He had adapted, transformed, become something that existed outside normal human limitations. Not supernatural, but beyond what anyone had thought possible. Hayes lowered his gun. Silas nodded once, a gesture that might have been respect, or acknowledgement, or simple farewell. Then he was gone, vanished into the darkness as completely as if he had never existed at all. Captain Edward Hayes filed his official report on September 3, 1859. The report stated that Silas, the escaped slave responsible for 23 murders in Culpeper County, had been tracked to the abandoned Rutledge plantation, where he had taken his own life by hanging in the very cellar where he had been imprisoned. The body, Hayes wrote, had been burned according to health regulations and the ashes scattered. The case was officially closed. No one questioned the report. The people of Culpeper County wanted to believe it was over, and Hayes had given them permission to believe. The bodies were buried, the families mourned, and slowly, carefully, the county began to rebuild its shattered sense of security. But there were rumors, of course. There are always rumors. Some said they had seen a pale figure moving through the woods at night, heading north along paths used by fugitive slaves. Others claimed that in Pennsylvania, in the years following the war, there was a white-haired man who worked with the Underground Railroad, who had an uncanny ability to move without sound, who never spoke of his past. A man who, some said, would sometimes sit in complete darkness for hours, perfectly still, as if he were back in that cellar, waiting. Benjamin, the former house servant, told a story before he died in 1891. He said that one night, years after the events in Culpeper, he woke to find someone sitting at the foot of his bed, a pale figure with white hair and colorless eyes. He said the figure looked at him for a long moment, then spoke in a whisper. "You fed me. Even when others forgot, you remembered. Thank you." Then the figure was gone, and Benjamin never saw him again. Thomas, who had opened the cellar door, moved to Ohio after the war and became a schoolteacher. He told his students about the importance of human dignity, about what happens when society forgets that every person, regardless of their skin color, is human. He never mentioned Silas by name, but his students said he would sometimes sit in complete silence during classes, staring into the middle distance, as if seeing something no one else could see. The Rutledge plantation was never sold. It sat abandoned for decades, slowly collapsing in on itself. The cellar door remained locked, and local children were warned never to go near it. Stories grew around the place, that you could hear scratching from below the ground, that pale figures moved through the ruins at night, that anyone who descended into the cellar would never come out the same. In 1923, a developer from Richmond purchased the land and tore down all the remaining structures, including the kitchen house. When workers broke through the floor to fill in the cellar, they found something unexpected: the bones of 7 rats, carefully arranged in a circle on the stone floor, and in the center, scratched into the stone in letters barely visible, a single word: remember. The developer, disturbed by the discovery, ordered the cellar filled immediately with concrete. Today, there's a shopping center on the site. The people who park their cars and buy their groceries have no idea what lies beneath the pavement. The story of Silas has faded into local legend, one of dozens of ghost stories told to frighten children on dark nights. But if you visit Culpeper County, if you talk to the old families who have lived there for generations, you'll find that some of them still lock their doors at night. Some of them still check the shadows before they go to sleep, because they remember the story their grandparents told them, about the pale man who spent 12 years in darkness and emerged as something that existed between human and shadow, between man and myth. And sometimes, on certain nights when the moon is dark and the air is still, people swear they can feel someone watching from the darkness. Not threatening, not violent, just watching, waiting, patient as stone. A reminder that some stories, no matter how much we want them to end, never really do. They simply wait in the darkness, like Silas did, until someone opens the door and lets them out again. The official records say Silas died in 1859, but records can be wrong. And in the dark places where history forgets to look, where the forgotten and the erased still whisper their truths, some say he's still out there, still moving north, still searching for the freedom that was promised 12 years too late. What do you think happened to Silas? Did he really die in that cellar, or did he escape to find the freedom he had dreamed of? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the darkness that humans can inflict on each other and the strength it takes to survive it, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories that history tried to bury. Share this video with someone who appreciates deep, unsettling tales about America's hidden past. The next story might be even darker. Until then, remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves.